The contract was 9 pages long, printed on paper so thick it felt like it was designed to outlive the people signing it. Diane Whitmore slid it across her late father's mahogany desk, exactly the way a diner waitress tosses a check over the counter, abrupt, cold, and final. She didn't offer a handshake. She didn't even state her name. The way her eyes swept over my faded Carhartt jacketed and mud-caked work boots said everything. She'd already figured out exactly what kind of man I was before I even walked through the door. A blue-collar zero, someone who could be bought. Marry me for 6 months, she said, her voice dropping below freezing. Then vanish from my life. I didn't budge. I sat up straight, hands folded in my lap, refusing to be rushed. A hard life had taught me a brutal lesson. In any negotiation, silence is its own kind of leverage. I turned the pages slowly, reading every single one. All 9 of them. And on day 180, I asked, we walk away, clean. No strings, no messy aftermath. You get enough cash to settle whatever desperate problem brought you to a job like this, and I keep my father's company out of the hands of the people who should never have it. She paused, her gaze dripping with charity. The figure is on page 7. I flipped to page 7. My face didn't give away a thing, but my chest tightened. That number was enough to save my moving business on Merrimon Avenue from bankruptcy. It was enough to keep my 51-year-old partner, Russell, from having to carry his blown-out knees over to the unemployment line. 10 years ago, if someone had tried to weaponize money to humiliate me like this, I would have burned their entire empire to the ground. What Diane Whitmore didn't know, what she was going to spend the next 6 months slowly and painfully figuring out, was that the man sitting across from her had signed papers just like these before. Except I used to sit on her side of the desk, calling the shots before my own empire collapsed. I picked up the pen and signed with a single sharp stroke. Then I looked her dead in the eye. See you at the altar, honey. We both thought it was a straight-up business transaction. I was selling 6 months of my freedom. She was buying her seat at the head of the table. But neither of us saw day 179 coming. On that final night, the proud woman who had treated me like hired help stood outside my bedroom door, shaking. She was crying so hard she lost her voice, begging me to rip up the 180-day contract she had personally written. If you want to know how a dismissed blue-collar guy managed to bring a billionaire heiress to her knees on day 179, hit that subscribe button right now. Go ahead, I'll wait. Now that we're set, let me take you back to where it all actually started. A storage locker auction at a parking lot off Route 9 in Asheville, North Carolina, on a Tuesday morning that smelled like rain and old wood. That was the day my beat-up truck and Russell were hired to clean out her late father's estate. My name is Keanu Revis. I'm 43 years old, and this game is just getting started. Keanu Revis has been doing this work for 11 years. Before that, he was in a different room entirely, with different clothes and a different name on his business cards, making decisions that moved numbers instead of furniture. He doesn't talk about that period. Not to Russell, not to anyone. There is a phone number saved in his contacts under the initials T. W that he has not dialed in 4 years. He checks it sometimes when it is very late, and then puts the phone face down. He is raising his nephew, a 19-year-old named Philip, who came to live with him 3 years ago after Keanu's younger brother made a series of choices that ended in a county court and a custody form. Philip is studying welding at Asheville Buncombe Technical Community College on a scholarship he got himself. He leaves before 6 every morning without being asked. He leaves the kitchen clean. Keanu Revis watches him sometimes, this kid who didn't ask to be dropped into a harder version of life and simply got up and started walking. He doesn't know how to say what that does to him, so he says nothing and instead makes sure the truck is always fueled and Philip never has to ask for anything twice. The Whitmore estate job came through the high-end clearance network, the channel reserved for situations where a very wealthy person has died, and the family needs the evidence of that wealth handled with discretion. The pay was more than Keanu Revis usually saw in a full month. He took it without hesitation. He didn't know whose estate it was until Russell pulled the truck through a set of iron gates on Kensington Ridge Road, and they both looked at the house at the same time, and neither of them said anything for a full 3 seconds. The man who had lived there was named Warren Whitmore. If you followed business news at all in the Southeast, you knew the name. He had built Whitmore Industrial Group from a sheet metal fabrication shop in Charlotte into a regional manufacturing conglomerate worth just under $2 billion over 4 decades of work that was, by every account, relentlessly, unsentimentally disciplined. He died at 77 of a stroke he had refused to see a cardiologist about because, according to people who worked with him, he considered doctors to be people who charged you for information you already had. His daughter, Diane Whitmore, 40 years old, had just been named CEO of everything he left behind. She was standing in the middle of the main foyer when Keanu Reeves and Russell came through the front door, a tablet in one hand and a phone in the other, moving through 3 conversations simultaneously in a way that made the air around her feel slightly faster than normal. She looked through Keanu Reeves the way you look through a window. He had grown up with that particular brand of being seen and not seen. The kind where a person's eyes rest exactly on your face and somehow find nothing there. He noted it. He did not take it home with him. What changed things on that first day was not anything he said. It was the way he handled a box. He found it in the study on the 2nd floor, a cardboard banker's box, unsealed, labeled in a woman's handwriting that had nothing to do with the inventory tags the estate attorneys had placed on everything else. Inside was what appeared to be a man's entire private record of his own life, an anniversary card still in its envelope, a photograph of a woman with dark hair at a lake, young, laughing, the kind of photo that gets kept in a box and never in a frame because a frame would make it too visible. A small leather notebook with the initials WHW tooled into the cover. Keanu Reeves set the box aside separately. He wrapped each item in tissue paper before repacking it. He put the notebook back last, face up, the way you put a book down when you intend to come back to it. Diane came around the doorframe at some point during this and stopped. She stood in the hallway watching him wrap her dead father's things in tissue paper for what he would later estimate was nearly 2 minutes. She didn't say anything. He didn't look up. When he finished, he stood and picked up the box with both hands, level, as if it had weight that mattered. "That goes with you," he said. "Not to storage." She took the box. Her jaw was doing the thing it does when a person is holding a room inside their chest and has nowhere to put it. She still looked through him when she passed. But that evening, on his way out, she stopped him at the front door. "The crew tomorrow," she said. "Just you, not the other man. Russell does half the work. Bring him. But I want you on the study personally." She didn't explain why. She didn't look at him when she said it. But he heard the thing she wasn't saying, which was that she trusted what she had seen, even if she hadn't decided yet to trust the man she had seen it in. He came back 4 days in a row. The job that was supposed to take 2 ended up taking 4 because the house was larger and more lived in than the initial inventory suggested, and because Diane Whitmore kept finding rooms that needed more care than a standard clearance team would give them. On the 3rd day, she brought him a cup of coffee without asking how he took it. She had guessed black. She was right. On the 4th day, he was loading the last of the labeled furniture into the truck when she appeared at the loading dock and said, "Without preface, I need to speak with you about something that isn't about the furniture." The contract was 9 pages long. He read all of it. He asked 3 questions. She answered 2 of them directly and deflected the 3rd with the particular precision of someone who has spent a long time making sure conversations end on her terms. The situation, stripped of its legal language, was this. Warren Whitmore's estate included a clause drafted by Warren himself in the final revision of his will that required the primary heir to be legally married within 90 days of assuming leadership of Whitmore Industrial, or controlling interest would transfer to a board-appointed trustee drawn from a list of names that Diane described as people her father had spent 40 years building the company to outlast. She said the word trustee the way a person says a word they are not going to say again. She needed a husband on paper. She needed someone with no connection to the industry, no financial stake, and no reason to make it complicated. She had found him through a service that matched estate attorneys with clearance contractors, and somewhere in the paperwork his name had crossed her desk, and she had done what Diane Whitmore did with information, which was research it until she was satisfied. She knew he ran a small company. She knew he had been doing it for 11 years. She knew he had no criminal record and no outstanding debts. She did not know why a man like him was running a two-truck moving operation in Asheville, and she did not ask, because it was not relevant to the transaction. He thought about Philip asleep in the passenger seat of the truck on job days when class wasn't in session, his head against the window with his welding textbook open across his knees. He thought about the alternator that was going to need replacing before the month was out. He thought about the look on his brother's face in the courthouse 3 years ago and the look on Philip's face an hour later, and how those two expressions had nothing in common even though they occupied the same afternoon. He picked up the pen and signed, what Diane Whitmore had not accounted for, and what she would later describe in a private conversation as the single largest miscalculation of her professional life, was the effect of proximity. Not romance, not sentiment, proximity, the specific accumulation of days in which a person you have decided is a function turns out to be a human being with a gravity of their own. She had prepared for a business arrangement. She had not prepared for a man who got up at 5 every morning and made coffee for everyone in the house before anyone else was awake. She had not prepared for the way he listened in board meetings she brought him to, not as the husband prop, not with boredom, but with the careful attention of someone assembling a picture from its parts. She had not prepared for Philip, who came to dinner the second week and addressed her directly, without performance, with the ease of someone who had been taught that most people are just trying. And she had not prepared for the moment, 6 weeks in, when she came downstairs at midnight and found Heiress sitting at the kitchen table with the small leather notebook, the one with her father's initials, open in front of him. He wasn't reading it, he was just sitting with it. She stood in the doorway for a moment. He heard her and closed the notebook carefully and slid it across the table without a word. She sat down across from him. Neither of them spoke for a while. He wrote in it every day, she said finally. Right up until the week he died. I didn't know that until I found the last entry. She paused. He wrote about me. Not the company, me. Heiress didn't say anything. He wrote that he hoped I learned to put the armor down before it got too heavy to carry. She picked up the notebook and held it with both hands. I found that after I had already hired a lawyer to make sure the trustees couldn't touch the Eastern Division assets. Which is probably exactly the kind of thing he was talking about. She laughed. It was a short, quiet sound, and it appeared to surprise her more than it surprised him. That was the first night that felt like something other than a transaction, but there were still the days at the office. And those days were where things became, the only word for it is ugly. Diane's executive team had been in place under Warren for a combined total of over 90 years. They were 5 men who had built their identities inside the structure Warren had created, and they experienced Diane's ascension with a specific kind of hostility that dressed itself in courtesy. They called it concern. They framed it as fiduciary responsibility. What it was, under every layer of conference room language, was the refusal to recognize someone they had decided, on what evidence was never stated, was not qualified to sit in her father's chair. Their leader, if you could call him that, was a man named Gerald Fitch, Executive Vice President of Operations, 61 years old. He had a photograph on his desk of himself and Warren at a charity golf event from 11 years ago, and he referenced it the way people reference old friendships when they want to establish a claim that isn't actually theirs to make. Gerald Fitch was not stupid. That was the thing that made him dangerous. He knew exactly how far he could go in a room before a room became a record. His brand of cruelty was administrative, a meeting scheduled, and then quietly moved so that Diane arrived to an empty conference room. A memo circulated about a division restructure that she had approved, worded in language that implied the approval had been reluctant. An email chain about a major vendor contract that ended 3 messages before her name appeared, so that she was always slightly behind the conversation, always being informed rather than deciding. And then there was what he did with Heiress. Heiress tended 2 board events in the first month because Diane's attorneys had advised that visibility mattered for the legitimacy of the marriage record. He came in the clothes he owned. He was not a man who performed comfort in a room. He simply had it, the unhurried stillness that reads as confidence to people looking for it and reads as insufficiency to people looking for something to use. Gerald Fitch was looking for something to use. At the second event, a dinner at the Asheville Club on Cumberland Avenue, Gerald brought 3 members of the board to a conversation with Keanu Reeves that had been engineered to look casual. They asked him about his work. He told them. They asked him follow-up questions with the specific pitch of people who have already decided the answers will be amusing. Moving furniture, Gerald said in a tone of complete neutrality that was somehow the most contemptuous sentence in the room. It's an essential service. He paused just long enough. My grandfather was in transportation too, actually. Different scale, of course, but the ethic is the same, I think. The man to his left laughed at something that hadn't technically been a joke. Keanu Reeves picked up his water glass. He set it down. He said, "Your grandfather would probably have got on with my partner, Russell. Russell's been at it since 1987. Knows more about how a house actually works than most people who've ever owned one." He said it without edge. He meant it. Gerald smiled the smile of a man who had not gotten what he wanted and intended to find another way to get it. He found it 2 weeks later, the vendor contract, a supply agreement with a composite materials company that Diane had been negotiating to restructure, hit a problem. A clause in the renegotiated terms had been quietly amended, in the version that went out under Diane's signature, in a way that shifted liability for a portion of the material defect costs onto Whitmore Industrial in scenarios that would almost certainly materialize within 18 months. The amendment was 4 words in a paragraph on page 12 of a 40-page document, the kind of 4 words that take a specialized eye to find. The version Diane had approved did not contain those 4 words. Gerald's fingerprints were nowhere on the amended version. His assistant's assistant had sent it. The chain of transmission was long enough to be deniable and short enough to be traceable, if someone were looking carefully. Nobody was looking yet. What Gerald had calculated was that when the liability clause surfaced, and it would surface with Diane's signature on it, and the board would have exactly the kind of evidence they needed to begin the conversation about trustee oversight. And Warren Whitmore's daughter would spend the next 18 months defending herself from a problem that had been built into the floor beneath her feet without her ever once stepping on the board that triggered it. He had run this kind of operation before, not with this company, but the mechanism was the same, and it had worked before. What Gerald had not calculated was Keanu Reeves, not because of anything dramatic, because of page 7. During the 4th week, late Thursday night, Keanu Reeves was at the desk in the guest room with what he would tell you was nothing, just a habit, just the thing his hands do when his mind is sorting. He had been reading through a copy of the vendor contract that Diane had left on the kitchen counter after a long call with her legal team. She had marked 3 sections in red pen. Page 7 was not one of them. He read it 3 times. He was not a lawyer, but he had spent enough years in rooms where documents shaped outcomes to understand what 4 words in a liability clause on page 12 were doing in a paragraph that had not needed them. He brought it to Diane at breakfast the next morning and set it in front of her without commentary. He pointed to the paragraph. Then he put his coffee down and went to the window. She read it. She read it again. She set the document down on the table very carefully, the way people set things down when their hands are not fully under their control. "This wasn't in the version I approved," she said. "I know. How do you?" She stopped herself. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone recalculating a figure they thought they had already solved. "You read contracts." He said nothing. She called her in-house counsel at 6:40 in the morning. She had the original version and the transmitted version on the table within the hour. By noon, a forensic document specialist contracted out of Charlotte was tracking the amendment through the transmission chain. By 3 in the afternoon, the chain had a name at the end of it. Not Gerald Fitch directly. His assistant's assistant, a young man named Brandon Cole, who had been with the company for 16 months, and who, when reached by Diane's attorneys, held out for approximately 4 minutes before explaining in considerable detail is exactly what he had been instructed to do and by whom. Gerald Fitch received a call at 4:17 in the afternoon. The board meeting was not a meeting in any normal sense. It was a room where Gerald Fitch walked in expecting to preside and discovered, instead, that the chairs were already arranged and that every person in them had received the forensic document summary by email 90 minutes earlier. Gerald sat down. He looked at the table. He did the thing that people do when the story they have been telling themselves encounters a fact it cannot absorb. As he held very still, and then he said, "I want my attorney present for this conversation." Diane looked at him across the table. "You're welcome to call whoever you'd like, Gerald. Though I should tell you that Brandon Cole has already provided a signed statement. And IT has the full transmission record, and the board has read both." She paused. "You're not being charged with anything in this room. This room is just going to let you hear what happens next." What happened next was that Gerald Fitch was removed from his position effective immediately, with the board's unanimous vote taking 11 minutes to complete. His benefits package was restructured. His non-disclosure agreement, which he had assumed protected him, was reviewed by outside counsel and found to contain a fraud exemption that he had signed off on himself 8 years earlier. The legal exposure he was facing in connection with the document amendment made the news cycle in Charlotte 48 hours later, which is how these things get out when someone in the building has a journalist's cell phone number and a sense of what a story is worth. His photograph with Warren came down from the wall of the executive floor on the same afternoon. No announcement was made about this. It simply was not there the next morning when people came in. That absence, the empty hook where the frame had been, said more than anything that was said in the boardroom. In the weeks that followed, Gerald Fitch's name circulated through the industry in the way that names circulate when they have been attached to something that cannot be walked back. 3 board positions he had held at other organizations quietly did not renew. His country club membership lapsed and was not reinstated. He was seen once by a woman who worked in Whitmore's accounting department and mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone else at a hardware store on Sweeten Creek Road in a parking lot, sitting in his car for a long time without getting out. He had not at that point admitted to anything beyond what the documents proved. He had not apologized. He had not, as far as anyone knew, said out loud the words that would have required him to acknowledge that the woman he had spent 4 months methodically undermining had been right about everything he had decided she was wrong about. He was not the kind of man who said those words. But there is a particular look a person gets when they have spent 40 years as the person in the room who controls things, and they are standing in a parking lot at a hardware store, realizing they are not that person anymore and were never quite what they believed they were. The woman from accounting only saw him for a moment through the glass. She said afterward that he looked smaller than she had expected. That was all she said. Day 179 arrived on a Saturday morning in October, when the light over the mountains east of Asheville had the specific amber quality that only appears for about 3 weeks a year, and that makes the city look like something that belongs to itself. The company was safe. The vendor contract had been resolved correctly. The board had unanimously affirmed Diane's leadership in a formal resolution that her attorney described as unusually strong language for that kind of document. The trustees on her father's list had no mechanism left to invoke, and the contract, the original 9 pages still sitting in the file her attorney kept, was set to terminate in 24 hours. Canu Revis was in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, where he always was, when Diane came downstairs. She was already dressed, which was unusual for a Saturday. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him pour coffee into a second mug that he set on the counter beside his own without turning around. She picked up the mug. She held it with both hands. "You found the 4 words," she said. "I read things." "You read things." She looked at the coffee. "You also know when a room is about to be used against someone. And you know how to wrap a dead man's glasses in tissue paper, and you know when to say nothing and when to say the one thing." She paused. "Who were you before this?" He didn't answer right away. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post at the edge of the garden and sat there. Someone who sat on the other side of tables like that one. He nodded toward the study, for a long time. "Then I decided I'd rather be on the side that carries things." She looked at him. "The contract ends tomorrow," she said. "I had my attorney prepare the separation paperwork. It's clean. It's what we agreed." He picked up his coffee. He said nothing. She set her mug down on the counter. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, and it did not have the quality of a negotiation. It did not have any of the architecture she put around things to keep them at a distance. "I don't want you to go." He waited. I'm not saying that as someone who needs the arrangement to continue. The arrangement is finished, the company is mine, and it will still be mine in 24 hours regardless of what you do. She looked at her hands. I'm saying it as a person who has spent her entire life making sure she never needed anyone to stay, and who woke up this morning and realized she had completely failed at that. Because I need you to stay. Not Keanu Reves, the solution to a legal problem. You, and Philip, who fixed my downstairs bathroom faucet without being asked and refused to let me pay him for it. The two of you. She looked up. I know what I'm asking. I know it isn't in any of the 9 pages. I know you've been living someone else's framework for 6 months and that you have a company and a life and a person you're responsible for who has nothing to do with this house. She stopped. She swallowed. I know it would be completely reasonable to walk out tomorrow, and I know I have no standing to ask you not to. She put her hands flat on the counter. I'm asking anyway, because my father wrote in that notebook that I needed to put the armor down before it got too heavy, and I kept telling myself I'd do that sometime later, when things were settled, when the company was secured, when I had time. And I've run out of later, so I'm doing it now in the kitchen in the most undignified way possible, with no contract around it. The crow on the fence post ruffled its feathers once and went still. Keanu Reves put his coffee down. He looked at her for a moment, the way he looked at things when he was assembling the whole picture. I'm not going to say yes to that, he said. Something moved across her face. Not because the answer is no, he said. Because yes is the wrong answer to what you just asked me. He turned to face her fully. You just dropped the armor in a kitchen at 6 in the morning because your father's notebook told you to. That's not nothing. That's the bravest thing I've seen anyone do in a long time, but I'm not going to stand here and say yes to stay because you asked me to. He moved to the counter. He picked up her coffee and put it back in her hands. I'm going to stay, he said, because I was already going to. Because I was sitting in this kitchen at 6 in the morning on a Saturday, which is not something a person does in a house they're planning to leave. Because Philip told me 3 weeks ago that if I walked away from this, he would be deeply disappointed in my judgment. And Philip is usually right. He looked at her steadily, and because you are a person who wrapped her own grief in competence and called it leadership for 20 years, and somewheres inside that, you forgot to leave a door open, and watching you remember that door exists has been worth every single day of this. He said it the way he said everything, without recreation, without the performance of it. Diane Whitmore, who had faced a boardroom of men who wanted her to fail, who had taken her father's 40 years and defended them line by line, who had held her grief at a distance for 3 years because there was always something else that needed her first. She stood in the kitchen and let the armor go. Just set it down, the way you set something down when you are done carrying it. Okay, she said, it came out smaller than she's expected. She didn't try to fix it. They tore up the separation paperwork together over the recycling bin, not ceremonially, just efficiently, the way you get rid of a thing that served its purpose and no longer does. Keanu Reves kept his company, all of it. He and Russell took on 2 more trucks the following spring, which was something they had been delaying for 2 years because the timing was never right. He went to work each morning before Diane's calls started. He came home and made coffee for everyone in the house and knew by the sound of the front door how the afternoon had gone. He learned gradually which arguments with the board were worth her energy and which were not, and she learned to ask him. Not because he always knew, but because the act of saying it aloud helped her find the answer herself. Philip finished his welding certification with honors. He got a job offer from a structural fabrication firm in Weaverville that had a contract with a wind energy project running through western North Carolina. He took it. He left the kitchen clean on his last morning in the house. There was a note on the counter that said in his handwriting, "Take care of each other," which was more than he usually said about anything and therefore meant everything. Keanu Reves and Diane were married on a Tuesday in March at the county courthouse in Asheville, with Russell as witness and a clerk named Dorothy who had been doing this job for 31 years and who said afterward that she could always tell the ones that were going to hold. There was no reception. They went to a diner on Marymount Avenue after. the one Keanu Revis went to on job mornings, and they ate breakfast food at 2 in the afternoon because it was what he suggested, and it turned out to be exactly what she wanted. She brought the leather notebook. It sat on the table between them while they ate. At some point, without either of them making a decision about it, she opened it to the last entry and read it again. She had read it many times, but this was the first time she read it without the weight of what she hadn't done yet pressing against the words. She closed it, she put it in her bag. Outside, the March light on the street had that particular Asheville quality that arrives just before the trees come back, when everything looks like it is holding its breath before deciding to begin. He looked at her across the table. She looked back. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. You know, I've spent 11 years carrying other people's things from one place to another. And what that teaches you, if you're paying attention, is that the heaviest objects are never the furniture. The heaviest thing a person owns is the story they have been telling themselves about what they don't deserve. You can have it wrapped in policy and legal language and executive authority and still be carrying it every single day, and it will wear you down in ways that are invisible right up until the moment they aren't. Diane Whitmore's father wrote in a small leather notebook every day of the last years of his life. He wrote to his daughter. He told her that the armor would protect her from everything worth having. He was right about that, and she put the armor down on a Saturday morning in October with no audience and no contract, and the man she said it to had been planning to stay anyway. That's the whole story, or the important part of it. Sometimes the person who carries your things across a threshold turns out to be the person who sees you most clearly. And sometimes the woman who hired a stranger to solve a legal problem discovers, one tissue-wrapped pair of glasses at a time, that she already had everything she needed and had been doing exactly the wrong things to keep it safe. Gerald Fitch's photograph came down off the wall of the executive floor in November. Nobody put anything in its place. After a while, people stopped noticing the hook. Warren Whitmore's notebook sits on a shelf in a house on Kensington Ridge Road. Next to it, in a plain frame that Keanu Revis put up on a Sunday afternoon, is a photograph of a woman at a lake. Young, laughing, the kind of photo that belongs in a frame when there are finally people in the house who understand why.